Hey everybody, Andrew from Gameosity here, also Vagabond, and today we are going to be looking at an excellently designed asymmetrical multiplayer war game that is shockingly accessible and really interesting in its approach. It's Root by Leader Games. So, first things first, quick summary. Root, as I said, asymmetrical war game. Each player of the four that can play at max player count is going to be trying to get to first to 30 points, and the way you're going to be doing that is primarily through controlling the board and affecting the board state. And really, that's where the similarities end, and the general description has to kind of end there too, because it's a completely asymmetrical game. Each of the four-player character roles are going to operate completely differently, have different ways of scoring points, and have different mechanics that dictate how they interact with the board. Now, I have to get it out of the way up front because another game published by Leader Games that was, to my mind, sort of the pioneer. It probably wasn't absolutely the first, but certainly one of the most ambitious examples of asymmetrical multiplayer gameplay I've seen in a board game, looks in some ways a lot like this. Faction boards, different pieces, different objectives and methods of interacting with the game and with each other. And one of our chief complaints about Vast, if you watch that review, is that we had a lot of trouble sort of walking into the game the first time. And one of the things that you should know about Root from the very beginning is that it has been designed, clearly with lessons learned from Vast, as a much more friendly to new players experience. You have the rulebook, you have the learn to play book that sort of walks you in, and you have a sample turn 1 and 2 for all four factions of the game. So if the scale of Vast was anything that sort of put you off for trying that game, and it was a negative for us when we played it, then rest assured that Root is a lot more welcoming, despite the fact that in most ways Root's a much more complicated game. Quick rundown of the four factions. The first one is the Eyrie Dynasty. The dynasty is really interesting. They were in control of the forest for a long time. They've since been deposed, and they're looking to regrow their influence and reestablish their government. The whole mechanism with the dynasty is fascinating. They're essentially a giant bureaucracy. And there are these four actions that they will take, and the dynasty player must grow the bureaucracy by adding cards to the actions, and then must execute all of the actions every turn. So, for example, if you've got cards that say, we're going to add 2 troops to the board and we have to move 3 times, well, you have to do that, and if for whatever reason you can't, then that government actually collapses. That leader is deposed, and a new dynasty government comes into place. It's this really interesting, not push your luck, but how far can you push your current setup, and how much can you get done before there is a total collapse of your government and you have to start again. Then there's the Marquis de Cat. They are the current rulers over the forest, and they earn points by establishing themselves more firmly as being in control. They're going to be adding different structures from their player board to the forest, and they have this sort of engine of productivity that's going to generate points for them every turn. The other thing that is reflective of the fact that they're currently in power is that they have the easiest time staying on the board. Should they ever be defeated in combat, they can usually at least retain 1 or 2 of their troops by pulling back to their stronghold, which can't be removed. They're a very interesting faction to play in that they represent sort of the stability of the current government, and they're just trying to grow that stability. The third faction, the Woodland Alliance, are sort of the forest grassroots insurgent movement. They're trying to overthrow not only the cats, but also the birds. Essentially, they're a government of be animals for the animals. They will earn points by generating sympathy. Essentially, they grow their influence across the board, not by necessarily defeating other faction tokens, but by becoming popular in these different locations. And in fact, if other factions knock them off the board, then those factions pay the price in lost popularity, which can give the Woodland Alliance their points. Now, the Woodland Alliance is also adept at guerrilla warfare. They're excellent at fighting on defensive. And also, occasionally they will just show up and all at once just wipe out all the units from every opposing faction in a city. Finally, there's the Vagabond. And what's interesting about the Vagabond is that he's not an army. He's a lone adventurer moving across the board, not really involved in the fighting over the forest, but looking to score points from it all the same. Essentially, the Vagabond is going to craft items and provide them to the different factions in order to make alliances, or he's also going to, if he ever becomes hostile with any of the other factions, is going to fight to remove those pieces from the board. The Vagabond plays a very interesting game because he's in some ways very difficult to control. In fact, he can't be moved off the board at all, unlike the warriors of opposing factions. And so he acts as this pressure mechanism for the other three players, who will inevitably find themselves distracted by each other, possibly long enough for the Vagabond to shoot in and take the win. Man, is it good. Root is this triumph of the asymmetrical multiplayer design. Where Root succeeds, one of the ways that Root succeeds, where other games haven't succeeded as well in trying to do something like this, is that all four factions really feel like they are participating in the same game. Everybody's invested in what everybody else is doing, and critically, it is not opaque what the other player's tactics are going to be. In fact, every player will get a card from each other faction that says, these are what my pieces are good for, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what my tactics might look like. One of the other sort of triumphs of component design is the back of every player board has, first of all, really good setup rules. These are the pieces. This is how many you should have. Here's the sort of complexity, the aggressiveness of a faction. So if you're like, oh, I don't really want to play a really combative faction, you'll find the one that's the least for you. But then also, once you're all set up, it'll tell you, this is sort of what your faction does. This is what you're looking to do. Here are some common strategies. Then you take this board, you flip it over, and then you get to work. Root is an interesting game in that it allows for a high level of interactivity without the monotony of the sameness of factions grinding up against each other. Combat is incredibly simple. The attacker and defender will roll a die. The attacker, if they have a higher number, will remove that many of the defender's pieces. Earlier in this review, I said that Root was a more complicated game, a more complex game than Vast, but the fact is that the mechanics are just easier to grab onto. But enough comparisons to Vast, because Root definitely stands well on its own. For Root to be called a war game and for it to say, 60 to 90 minute playtime, we found that we play it even faster than that. Don't necessarily play it really well, but we play it to the level of strategy that we want to engage, and we have this quick whole experience that is very thinky in very different ways for very different reasons. Jess, for example, she loves playing the Vagabond, probably because there's a plushie, but also because she really loves that whole I'm uninvolved in your conflict. I'm not managing an army. I've got this one character, and that speaks to. She's a role player. She's that's the way she likes to engage. We've got friends who are more about building tactical engines, and they love playing the dynasty, the Airy dynasty, Airy. I don't know. And so. The way the different factions play is different enough that they can appeal to different kinds of players, but at the end of the day, you're all sitting down and playing a war game, and I've gotten people to play Root who actively say they do not want to, nor do they enjoy playing war games. And so, for that reason alone, I think it's really spectacular. The great art doesn't hurt by any stretch. Kyle Ferrin's art is always phenomenal. Check out our icons all over our website. But all in all, we found Root, the base game of Root, to be tremendously satisfying. What's that? I said base game? You're right. The Riverfolk expansion for Root adds a couple of completely new factions. So the Riverfolk company, sort of titular folks, these are traders who are looking to earn victory points by establishing trade outposts and trading with other factions. There's the Lizard Cult, which starts out as this sort of like very tranquil, very peaceful cult that just wants to establish a few gardens throughout the map, but then very quickly will sort of grow as they attract followers and enact rituals and radicalize their cultists into acolytes, and then they can start doing battle. Riverfolk expansion also includes another vagabond, so that you could have two vagabonds on the board at the same time, and it even has the mechanical marquee. This is an automation for the Marquis de Cat faction that allows for competitive play with a mechanical faction, cooperative play against the mechanical faction, and even solo play if that's what you decide to do. The expansion will bring the total player count anywhere from 1 to 6, depending on how you mix the factions together, and you can there are even some basic rules for how to string together a co-op campaign where it is this ongoing game against the mechanical marquee. Overall, the Riverfolk expansion is just sort of more. It's more Root. It's more factions that allow for a bit of variety. I've never played it at 6. I intuitively, I feel like that's probably kind of bananas to have that many factions moving at the same time across the board. I get the sense it would be incredibly crowded incredibly quickly. But keep in mind, at the 6-player count, 2 of those factions are vagabonds who aren't controlling areas. They're just moving around, exploring stuff, and making trades. Overall, the Riverfolk expansion is just more Root for people who love Root, and that's a really good thing. And that's Root. We had a really great time with it. Everyone in our group thinks that Root is a phenomenal game, especially because everyone in our group likes something slightly different in the way they play their games, and while the different factions are playing the same game, everybody's invested in the board and what's happening on it, each of them plays just differently enough that the player who wants to build their tableau can do that, the player who wants to be a lone adventurer exploring ruins can do that, and the player who wants to amass an army of woodland creatures and occasionally slaughter a city full of enemies can go ahead and do that. Now, there is some issues, I think, possibly with the longevity of this game. Like, I don't know if it's going to be a game that we play all the time over and over again, especially because once you've sort of played each of the factions, you'll probably have your favorite, and then you'll settle into the pattern of what that faction does and is good at. On the other hand, I am 100% sure that this will be a game that we break out periodically, especially to introduce new players to, and to expose them to something unique and new and very beautiful across the table. Overall, we think Root tremendously succeeds, and I think that it's got a permanent spot in our collection because it's the war game that isn't. It's the multiplayer asymmetrical game that truly embraces that sentiment, and it's just really fun to play. And that's it. Hey, thanks for watching our review. If you want to go ahead and see a few more of our full-length reviews, click on that playlist. If you want to see our game in a minute, click over there. And if you'd like to subscribe to Gameosity, click that adorable vagabond. I'm kidding, it's a G now. Click it.